Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Later in the program, our expert panel discusses the implications of SpaceX's Crew Dragon spacecraft scheduled for launch this weekend. But first, joining us to discuss the upcoming National Defense Authorization Act markup in the House and Senate are Byron Callan of the independent Washington research firm Capital Alpha Partners and Michael Herson, the CEO of American Defense International, one of Washington's top defense lobbying firms. Guys, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be here, Vago.
Yeah, great to be back. Thank you.
And before we get started, our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our cyber coverage overall. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. Elbit Systems of America sponsors our virtual coverage of Quad A and SOFIC. And of course, Bell sponsors this podcast. Michael, let's talk a little bit about the NDAA markup. As Chairman Inhofe and Smith are working together to hammer out the contours of this process that starts on June 8. Where are we?
Well, the wheels are turning and a lot of progress has been made since we last talked about this. So tomorrow, the Senate will circulate a copy of their bill to the senators on the Senate Armed Services Committee in preparation for subcommittee markups on June 8th and June 9th. And then they have a full committee markup scheduled for June 10th. And if necessary, they block the next day to also finish up the bill. So we'll see floor action on that possibly before the end of June. The House is also laid down their marker. They are going to do their subcommittee markups on June 24th and 25th. And they have scheduled a full committee markup for July 1st and July 2nd. Two-day markups are unusual, but in light of the crisis, that is their current plan. Now, the problem the House is facing is will some members need to be remote or not? They have asked all 56 members of the committee. 4 members on the Democratic side have said that they would like to be remote. That does throw a possible wrench into the process because under the new rules, they would have to do a practice markup in addition to the regular markup. And then it makes questions Republican cooperation since they don't like remote voting and proxy voting. But I think that that's all going to be worked out just fine. The Republicans seem to be cooperating with that process.
And what is the status of the next relief package? I mean, there is a sense that the nation needs, as the Fed is still taking actions to sort of buoy the economy. Where are we on this upcoming package? Stimulus package?
Well, we're not much farther along than the last time we spoke about it, except that Senator McConnell has publicly acknowledged the need for a second stimulus for the next stimulus package. And he is getting pressure from some of the senators that are in tough states with tough reelects. So we do anticipate seeing a stimulus package next month. Now, what it will look like and what will be in it is another story because I think the House and the Senate and the White House are on very different pages. And as we saw with the FISA bill blowing up today, that the dysfunction in the House and the Senate continues. The only reason the House of Representatives is in session this week is to vote on the reauthorization of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The Senate had passed a pretty straightforward reauthorization. The House was scheduled to take it up this week with one amendment, which would have passed the Senate had Senator Bernie Sanders and Patty Murray been there to vote on it. So it wasn't seen as very controversial. But however, Adam Schiff and Zoe Lofgren were working on the language of that amendment, which would have limited the FBI's ability to access web history, search histories, and online activity without a warrant. And apparently they were accused by the Senate Democrats of watering it down too much. So the progressives jumped on this. And then the Republicans started to jump because the president came out and tweeted an opposition to the authorization of FISA, even though William Barr was involved in the negotiation of this bill.
Which is extraordinary.
It's absolutely extraordinary. I talked to several Hill staff today about this, and they were stunned. When is the Department of Justice going to be asking for less power to track people's search histories and information? So, that some people described it as possibly that could be the kill shot for this, because you've got Democrats and Republicans and the president actively tweeting. And the president tweeted this morning, "Thank you to our great Republican congressmen and congresswomen on your incredibly important blockage last night of the FISA bill."
Right.
That would perpetuate the abuse of the that produced the greatest political crime in the history of the United States, the Russian witch hunt. Fantastic job. So it's a tough road to hoe going forward on this.
And very quickly, give us a sense on what could be the sticking points between the House and Senate on the NDAA.
I don't think there are going to be any major sticking points between the House and Senate and the NDAA. We have a budget deal. They know what the top line is. Smith knows he needs Republican support to pass his bill. 29 Democrats sent a letter to Smith and Thornberry last week asking for a reduction in defense spending for FY21 in light of the money we're spending on the coronavirus pandemic. So that means he is not going to have the votes to pass the bill with just Democrats like he did last year. So he needs Republicans. So he's working very closely with his counterpart, Mac Thornberry. Thornberry spoke to his members this morning and acknowledged that fact. So I don't see any major hangups right now.
Byron, let me bring you in. We're 100,000 American fatalities into this, 40 million unemployed, and China is mounting as an even more hot button issue. Over Hong Kong, the United States is threatening sanctions. The Chinese have shrugged that off. Lawmakers are proposing expelling Chinese students if they're affiliated at all with Chinese military organizations. Where is this relationship going, and what does it mean for markets ultimately? Because we had a little bit of a correction today. What do you think? Where are we going?
Well, that's what's interesting, Vago. I mean, I think the market, was so narrowly focused on the idea that the country was coming back on stream, that, businesses are starting to reopen, and they really haven't been paying maybe as much attention as they should to the state of U.S.-China relations. And as you just pointed out, there was a sell-off on the 28th, kind of heading into the close. Market been up almost 1%. I think it's closed down. When it was announced that Trump was going to hold a press conference on Friday to really kind of outline some of the actions that he would take in response to this new security bill that Beijing has pushed through on Hong Kong. I don't know if there's anything brand new to say about this in the context of what it means for defense. I still, to Michael's points, I think it's going to be kind of interesting. Is there anything really brand new that's going to come in to the NDAA? I know both Senators Inhofe and Reid had an essay today, I think, in War on the Rocks, kind of underscoring the need for kind of an Indo-Pacific fund. But the best of what I can read, it looks like this is in line with something that Mac Thornberry proposed on the House side. You're really just kind of ring fencing funding and trying to give some more transparency. It's not like they're talking about adding money to the top line of the defense budget for this. So, but it's going to be a very rocky road for U.S.-China relations. I mean, China's not showing any kind of willingness to bend back on some of these Hong Kong issues. It's interesting what's going on between China and India. That hasn't gotten a lot of play here. And, I think the overall state is still, it's tense. It's going to be very tense, and it's probably going to get worse as the election year bears on, because the administration probably has a good reason to, beat up on China, and trying to position Biden as being soft on China. I think it's going to make that even more difficult going forward.
We've got about 2 minutes, Michael. Very quickly, get your sense up on Capitol Hill. How is this changing how lawmakers see the China issue? I mean, is there a consensus, as we had sort of agreed some months ago was the fact, or is this fracturing along partisan lines as well?
Actually, this is not fracturing along partisan lines. This is something that both Republicans and Democrats are raising as an issue. Now, in some ways the same way, in some ways in very different ways, but there is definitely bipartisan concern about supply chain and about bringing back certain manufacturing to the United States, both on the medical front and on the defense and national security front. But I think there's a lot of people lashing out at China because it's a very good political issue going into the November elections without a lot of focus and what the repercussions will be. But I think that you'll see some language in both NDAAs that will start to protect our supply chain. And in many cases, it's correct, because there is a lot of mischief in a lot of our security supply chain, which they want to make sure that they correct.
And you see lawmakers backing the administration's tough stance and even sanctions on on Hong Kong, as well as on the Uyghurs, which passed overwhelmingly in the House.
Yes, frankly, I think the Uyghur issue is long overdue. I mean, basically, this is a country that's got concentration camps that we are openly doing business with, and I think it's about time that we stood up on that.
And Byron, very quickly, in about 30 seconds, if you can, Lockheed Martin and Northrop, as well as other leading contractors, presented at the annual Sanford Bernstein conference, which obviously is always a flagship event. Talk to us about some of the key takeaways.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, particularly Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman both had a good week this week. The stocks were up, I don't know, 5-6%. It's hard to say, some of this may have been the repositioning. I think people looking at what was going on in Hong Kong and the state of US-China relationships and what the blowback might be out of that. But, Marilyn Houston and Kathy Warden were both pretty upbeat. Houston in particular on the F-35 program and just kind of the state of international demand for that product, and Warden on the ground-based strategic deterrent program. So, again, defense is kind of this oasis of earnings stability in a market where, you look at the layoffs that were announced by American Airlines or Boeing this week. It's been a very stable and for that reason, very attractive part of the market, despite some of the longer term issues that may be building as a result of the explosion in federal debt.
Guys, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Look forward to having you back on next week.
Thank you, Vago.
Great. Thank you very much.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. Joining us now are Chris Davenport, the space and defense industry reporter at the Washington Post and the author of the great book, The Space Barons, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the Quest to Colonize the Cosmos, and Todd Harrison of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Guys, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us. Hey, good to be back.
Todd, great having you on. And Chris, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope it's the first of many more times. I'm disappointed it's taken us so long, but it's great to have you on. Had the weather not intervened, SpaceX's Crew Dragon spacecraft with Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken aboard would have become the first commercial spacecraft and the first commercial astronauts in space. And the flight has been postponed until Saturday at 3:22 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time and would take off from the historic Pad 39A, where Apollo 11 and so many other historic missions originated from. Chris, you're down there in Cape Canaveral to cover the launch for the Post as well as the Discovery Channel, where you've been doing a tremendous job. To get a little bit deeper than sort of the superficial firsts, what's the deep significance of this launch, whether or not it's successful?
Thanks, Vago. I mean, it's a test of this, the capabilities of this growing commercial space industry that's led by SpaceX, but has many other companies and many other components. And it gets a lot of attention and a lot of hype because it's got people like Elon Musk at the helm. But, human spaceflight is really the holy grail. And for all of the accomplishments that SpaceX has had, with flying reusable boosters and all the talk of innovation and technology and, even flying the Falcon Heavy, the thing that SpaceX has never done is fly human beings. And if that goes well for them, then I think that will open up a new era in a real paradigm shift in human spaceflight and how we access space. But if it goes wrong too, I think, all of the critics, and there are many, will come out of the woodwork and say, we told you so. You never should have entrusted NASA's astronauts, with the private sector. So, I mean, I just think there's so much at stake with this. You just can't underestimate it.
But these guys, whether it's Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and those who actually came before, and even people like Andy Beal, but then you have Massey Space, right? I mean, you've got a number of guys who are in this field now. Burt Rutan, obviously with Spaceship One, backed by the late Paul Allen, who've completely reinvigorated the way and changed fundamentally the way people look at space, right? So how does that change given that the whole national security in the commercial launch space was so ossified effectively, and so staggeringly expensive and so slow moving.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the keys to this too, it's not like, SpaceX is sort of up and running and doing this on its own. It's, it's a commercial venture, but it's not 100% commercial. I mean, let's not forget that SpaceX does not exist without NASA. NASA really came to the rescue of SpaceX and saved it after, very early on awarding it contracts. I mean, that first cargo contract was 2008 for $1.6 billion. It's also had a lot of help, from the Pentagon. So NASA has invested, and the federal government really has invested heavily in SpaceX to allow it to flourish. So it's a little bit different than, say, what you've seen with, Virgin Galactic or the early efforts, with Spaceship One. Jeff Bezos has taken a different approach with his company, Blue Origin. But then again, he has the wealth almost of a nation unto himself. But, even you've heard the folks at Blue Origin talk about how they, want to stop being a nonprofit and actually start being a viable commercial company. And that just raises all of these questions about, what is commercial in space, and will we get to the point where there is a self-sustaining space economy where NASA or the federal government isn't still very much the key player as it still is today?
Todd, you've been studying this space. I mean, and Chris, I think it's very funny when you said, it's not a nonprofit, even though I think that people were saying that about Amazon for many years before it did become a for-profit, and then obviously became sort of a global juggernaut and salvation for a lot of people, frankly, during this pandemic. Todd, I want to bring you in because you've been studying this whole field extremely closely. For its policy implications and participating deeply and meaningfully in the debate with both lawmakers and the department. How do you see the ecosystem going forward? And do you think that a failed test would be something that would be such a massive setback, or would it be regarded, I think, just as one of the things that happens in a very, very difficult, after all, it's rocket science.
Yeah, I mean, space is hard, right? And everyone in the industry recognizes that. I would, to pull on a thread of what Chris was just talking about, I would say that a lot of times people like to oversimplify the space industry and say it's new space versus old space, and new space is commercial and old space is government. Government dominated parts of the industry. And, as Chris was pointing out, that's not quite true. That really, SpaceX has much of its existence to thank to these government contracts. That is true of the space industry writ large, that one of the biggest customers for space products and space services is the government still today. And so really, I think the distinction, though, is the level of government involvement in designing and levying requirements and buying a product, by specification, versus the government just saying, hey, I want a service, deliver me a service. And so that's where SpaceX has come in, is they're using a different model for interacting with the government, where they're basically saying, all right, you want cargo delivered to the space station? We'll deliver it. Yes, there are some requirements and parameters around that, but we are going to sell this to you as a service. When SpaceX sells launches to the Department of Defense, they sell launch services. The government is not buying a Falcon 9 vehicle; they're buying a payload delivered to orbit. And so that is an interesting distinction, right? And I think that we're going to see more and more of that in the future, where the government is going to buy things as a service from industry and not be as involved in setting the requirements and writing the specs and trying to buy a particular product. And so I think that's healthy for the industry going forward, and that's a sign of a good maturing industry. In terms of what happens if there's a failure, what we have seen from SpaceX in the past, and they have had failures in the past, is they bounce back quickly. They are determined, and so I don't think this will be the end of anything. If there is a failure, I mean, obviously it will be tragic and there will be a price to pay if there is, in many ways. But SpaceX will bounce back. They had the failure in the test of the emergency abort system on the ground. That was not good. They bounced back from it. They had a failure on launch of one of their cargo resupply missions several years ago. And of course, they had a failure on the pad where they were fueling a rocket and it blew up on the pad. In all of those cases, they used it as a learning opportunity. And that's part of the company culture of SpaceX is fail and learn and move forward. And so, I think that if something unfortunate happens, it's not going to be the end of it.
Chris, Todd just mentioned how quickly the company rebounded after that ground-based abort failure. It was titanium in the fuel lines that apparently caused or was the source of the explosion on a spacecraft that had already flown into orbit and was supposed to return this time with astronauts on it. How is this company able to move as fast as it moves? And what are the lessons that everybody, including government, can learn from them?
Yeah, I mean, that was such a great point that Todd brought up. And in its long relationship with NASA, SpaceX's, ethos of just, testing to the point of failure has made them very uncomfortable. And NASA's had to come around to that, so having this spacecraft, that had gone on its uncrewed test flight and everything was going so well, and that was perfect. And it seemed like, oh, now we're finally on the road to restoring human spaceflight from American soil. And then they had this happen, and for them to come back so quickly, it's just sort of one in another long series of examples of how SpaceX moves. I mean, my favorite example from my book was early on, one of the early flights of the Falcon 9 rocket. And I think it was maybe the first or second flight of Dragon, still very much in the test phase. And the day before the launch, they were doing a pre-flight inspection of the rocket and noticed a small crack in the nozzle of the second stage engine. And, they sat around the table and were saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And a lot of people thought, they come from traditional aerospace. Well, you pull down the rocket, you take it apart, you fix it, you look at your whole manufacturing procedure. What happened? How can we prevent this from ever doing it again? And they would have been delayed months and months. But instead, Elon said, well, can't we just cut around the crack? I mean, as if it were, a chip in your fingernail and you just clipped it off. And the guys around the table were like, well, it's a second stage engine. We have margin built in. They did the math and they're like, yeah, we can actually probably still hit our objective. So they did. And that night they flew a technician from headquarters in Hawthorne down to the Cape, and he had some equipment to cut around the nozzle, and they launched the very next day on time and didn't scrub. So I think that tells you all you need to know about how SpaceX, operates. Now, that was when they were still in the scrappy phase, and now they're becoming, not just the startup, but, the real industry player, a behemoth that's taking on Boeing. And they can't operate that way, when you're flying humans, but they still, I think, retain that kind of ethos that they're going to, encounter problems because, as Todd said, space is hard, and move quick and try to fix them.
I think what's amazing is that both Musk and Bezos have incredibly formidable scientific and engineering minds, which makes this particularly exciting and interesting. So they're not just billionaires who are dabbling. Todd, from the standpoint of lessons learned, how do you encapsulate what the most important lessons are for governments to learn from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that government can learn from SpaceX and from NASA's Commercial Cargo and Crew program is don't be afraid of failure, even for things that are as important, as mission critical as launching humans into space. You have to be willing to learn from mistakes. And it's kind of like what I try to tell my children too is, you only fail if you make a mistake and stop trying. When you make a mistake, that's an opportunity to turn it into a success. You just have to keep trying, and you may fail again and again. but eventually you can turn it into a success. And I think that's the good example that SpaceX gives us. Now, a contrast in that, and not in a bad way at all, is Blue Origin, where they're very, slow and methodical by comparison. They're trying not to make mistakes, but they are still making progress. They're not going to be, as Chris pointed out in his excellent book, Space Barons, it's like a tortoise and the hare. Blue Origin is clearly the tortoise. They're going slower, more methodically. But I think we've got interesting things to look forward to that we're going to see from Blue Origin in the next few years, given all the work and all the investment they've been putting in to their New Glenn rocket, which is a very large launch vehicle capability. So, you've got different approaches, but they achieve the same end goal, which is keep making, progress step by step, again and again. If you fail, just, learn from it and move forward. Too often in national security space, when there's a failure, when something goes wrong, everyone focuses on who's to blame and pointing the fingers, and let's add more layers of process so that this mistake never, ever happens again. And relatively less attention is paid to, okay, well, what did we learn from this mistake, and why was it good that we made this mistake?
So there has been a ferocious turning of tables on Boeing, one of the most historic names in launch, especially if you consider the McDonnell Douglas heritage of the company, as well as the Boeing heritage and the North American heritage of the company as well. And the Boeing Starliner, if I'm not incorrect, commanded by Chris Ferguson, who also commanded the last space shuttle flight, was supposed to have been, I think, the first manned return to orbit flight, U.S. return to orbit flight, but had a problem in December. The Starliner spacecraft had a problem. It was a computer program issue, and so the mission was deemed unsuccessful. And then Boeing was also passed over for the new lunar landing vehicle. I know that we've said that this isn't really a case of heritage, of sort of the old space and new space, but it is beginning to look a little bit like that. Are we approaching an end, a twilight for some of these historic names to be replaced by new ones?
Yeah, I mean, when these commercial crew contracts were first awarded in 2014, everybody thought Boeing was going to fly first. They're, the aerospace giant, more than 100 years old, had been NASA's partner, since the dawn of the space age. SpaceX was, the newcomer. Boeing had, as you mentioned, Chris Ferguson, who was a commander of STS-135, the very last shuttle mission. There's sort of a nice poetic bookend there. Although SpaceX, flying on SpaceX, is Doug Hurley, who was on that final shuttle mission as well. But Chris Ferguson and Boeing got all the attention. And then, during that test flight of the Starliner in December, right before Christmas, I mean, there's great anticipation that they were, SpaceX was ahead. They had done their test mission earlier in the year, and then along came Boeing, and they were going to catch up, and it just went wrong, like right from the minute the Starliner reached orbit. And I was there for that launch, and I was actually at NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine's side, and it was interesting because it was. The launch went very well. ULA had a very good launch. They put the Starliner in a relatively low orbit, and then it was going to have to do an orbital insertion burn to get it on track to the ISS, the space station. And that wasn't really happening until about T plus 30 minutes. So everyone's sort of celebrating. And I was standing there being like, well, wait, when is this orbital insertion happening? And the commentators were quiet. T plus 30 came and went. And then we found out, the computer system was off. It was off by 11 hours. As they're scrambling to fix that, they were having problems communicating with the spacecraft. They're looking at all of the software. They discovered as they were doing that another software problem that would have created an issue with the separation of the service module and the crew module, where they could have interacted with each other and maybe had a collision. That could have been, really, really bad. So it just sort of caught everyone by surprise that Boeing had all of these problems that set it back, and yet SpaceX which has also had a number of problems, but have moved fast and has raced ahead. And now Boeing's going to have to redo that whole test flight without astronauts and prove to NASA they can do that before moving on to where SpaceX is now, and that's flying astronauts.
But is there a bigger shift that's underway where some of these bigger legacy I would not have imagined that Boeing would have been ruled out, but Blue Origin, for example, and SpaceX making that cut?
Yeah, no, this changes the tables completely. I mean, it shows, not just the rise of SpaceX and the rise of everything that SpaceX represents in terms of this, new way that we've been talking about of tackling space and moving, much more like a Silicon Valley type ethos where you try and fail and then go back and fix and just iterate along the way. But it's interesting too, because you mentioned Blue Origin, and they're supposedly of that, mindset. But then for the lunar lander contract, they go out and partner with Lockheed Martin. They partner with ULA on the BE-4 engine and Vulcan. And so they've sort of blurred the lines, which is what Todd was talking about too. Everyone, it's easy to sort of put everyone in their separate camps. There's clearly blurring of lines. And I think what Boeing is learning is that they need to adopt some of SpaceX's, that kind of culture to move fast and to move faster too. So, as SpaceX becomes more sort of mainstream, I think Boeing is moving into becoming, a little bit more nimble too, or they're trying to.
And I should have said Dynetics was the third company to have gotten a contract. Todd?
Yeah, and so I would just say that we shouldn't frame it as like a binary shift in the space industry, that it's going to go from old space to new space. I think like the lunar lander contract shows, is that there are a lot of different combinations of these companies where they could work together on different piece parts and team in some cases, and compete for other projects. And in some cases, I think some of the newer entrants are going to win. And in other cases, some of the older legacy companies are going to win as well. And I would look at the DoD launch competition that's going on right now for the next launch vehicle for the military is a great example. You got 4 companies competing. One is ULA, the partnership between Boeing and Lockheed. They're the longtime incumbent in that, but they are bidding a brand new launch vehicle that has not flown before. You've got SpaceX. They're actually the incumbent in many ways, because they're the only ones bidding an existing launch vehicle that's already flown. You got Blue Origin, who's coming in with a new vehicle that hasn't flown. And then you've got Northrop Grumman, which is bidding their Omega rocket, which is also, it has not flown. It's made from components that have been used before. Very interesting combination of participants there. And who knows how that's going to shake out. And the acquisition strategy on that may evolve as well to end up supporting more than just 2 companies out of those 4. So we'll have to see. But I think this makes it a very exciting, dynamic sector of the industrial base, where there's going to be a lot of disruptive change going on. And the companies that succeed are going to be those that can adapt most quickly to that change.
Well, it's going to be utterly fascinating. I suggest everybody tune in to the Discovery Channel's coverage to see Chris's great coverage on Saturday. Launch is slated for 3:22 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for that instantaneous launch window, and then 18 hours later, God willing and Godspeed, the Bob and Doug show will be aboard the ISS. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Chris, break a leg on Saturday, and pass our very best along to the entire team down there, and look forward to having you guys back on next week for an after action. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vago.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.